Durable social change, durable social change. And the question of how you produce durable social change came to me, it's what I've been focusing on. I'm mainly an environmental lawyer, although I teach resource and Indian law as well. But the work I've been doing over the last few years with my co-author, Lonnie Guinier, is on how you produce durable social change. The metaphor of the Miners Canary was used a number of times yesterday, and I actually mildly chuckled to myself because that's the title of the book that Lonnie and I wrote, The Miners Canary, right? And we use it in this way. And what we wanted to do was to get past the what we felt were essentially sterile discussions of race and how race is used in producing change, and to propose a different hypothesis in order to discover who your allies might be and how you might construct a different politics. So we created this category that we call political race. And political race evolves this way. That is, if you notice the institutions that aren't working for black people and people of color, the chances are good that they're not working for other people as well. And so the task then is to identify those other people for whom these institutions are not working, not necessarily in the same way they're not working for black people or brown people or people of color in general, but other ways in which the institutions are not producing what you might think they would produce if they were functioning neutrally. Once you identify those people, right, then those are your allies. Right? Those are the people with whom you might make common purpose. Those are the people with whom you might struggle to produce the change that you want to see. So the Miners Canary, race is like the Miners Canary, then, in American institutions, right? That's the diagnostic function of race. So that when you, as I said, you just look around, right? That recent report, right, about, well, let me give you just an example, right? You take the drug war, right? The drug war has a more profound impact on black people. Well, that's, you can say mass incarceration is a terrible thing, and it is a terrible thing, and we ought to try to address it, right? But what it also suggests, right, if you look, is that this is a group of people who are no longer enfranchised. Right? To the extent those are felonies, they can't vote. So you're not just taking them out of the stream of the non-criminal population, you're taking them out of the stream of civic participation in a really profound way. Right? So the governor of Virginia, and this will relate to your talk because he's a Christian, said that I'm going to change that. And he, in fact, signed an executive order to re-enfranchise felons in Virginia, of all places. Right? So that's linked. You notice the drug war, and it takes you to democracy. Okay? But then you ask, who else is being disenfranchised? And how does the whole way we select our representatives reflect that disenfranchisement? One person, one vote, everybody thinks is a great idea. Districts they think are a great idea. None of this is required by the Constitution. So people in Jackson, Michigan, right, who are in a community that has the largest walled prison in the Western world, gets to count each one of those inmates as a member in their district, even though no one in that prison can vote. So that, in fact, the votes of the people in Jackson, Michigan, one person, one vote, yes, right, in fact, count more than the votes of the people in Detroit. Because they're representing, in terms of the voting population, a smaller category of persons. Okay? We can talk about virtual representation, but that's another question, right? So that race is a diagnostic. And the drug war, right, gets you into class issues, right? Noticing race gets you into class. And it says, okay, how can we reform institutions? Let's take the environment. How did environmental justice emerge? Environmental justice emerged just by noticing what the distribution of environmental burdens are, and whether or not that's a random distribution of environmental burdens, or whether there's a pattern to the distribution of environmental burdens. And if there's a pattern to the distribution of environmental burdens, maybe we ought to be conscious of the mechanisms that produced that pattern. And once we become conscious of the mechanisms that produce that pattern, then we ask, where can we intervene in the process to challenge that distributional pattern? Then that gets us back to democracy, gets us back to the way our system of representation works, gets us back to law. Now, law is important, but law is important for a couple of reasons, it seems to me. One is it gives you a way to produce rule changes, and rule changes are absolutely necessary. But I've long been a minority voice, I suppose, in the academy, for other reasons. Because I've argued that law is actually part of the humanities. It's as much a part of the humanities as it is part of the social sciences. And the reason it's part of the humanities is that law in our culture, especially American culture, is part of the process of meaning creation. And that lawyers need to be conscious of the impact of meaning creation in the way that they approach law, so that you don't produce durable legal change by just producing rule changes. Rule changes are important, right? Who can vote, who can't vote, what the penalties are for this, what the penalties are for that, whether you have to take certain environmental impacts into account as you make decisions, critically important. But more important, right, is the underlying cultural changes that are necessary, and those are the cultural changes come out of struggle. They come out of engagement. They come out of interacting with real people. Let me give you an example, a couple of examples. The first involved a strike in North Carolina. It was a Kmart distribution center. And one thing they noticed is that the wages at this Kmart distribution center were the lowest of any wages in the United States. And so the other thing they noticed is the workforce was mostly black. So the Reverend Nelson Johnson worked with the union, and Reverend Johnson said, look, if this is just a labor issue, the black community is not going to support it. If it's just a race issue, the labor community is not going to support it. But Nelson Johnson said, but what else? You know what else it is? It's a penalty to Main Street. Because for all of those workers who are being underpaid in comparison to other Kmart distribution centers, they have fewer dollars that they can spend on Main Street. So it's not just the black workers, it's not just the workers, it's also the businesses that depend on the engagement with these workers and the money they have to spend in Greensboro. So rather than just having a, quote, strike, right, what they had was a community strike, as it were, which is you got business people working with labor, working with the black community, working with the churches, in order to structure a complaint about this particular plant and why it was functioning in the way it was functioning. Now, of course, the Miners Canary, right, were the black workers, right? But that led them just to see who their allies are in this community and how they might engage those allies to produce the kind of change they needed to produce. And there was actually a funny event, a relatively funny event, I suppose. Some black preachers and workers went to pray at the Kmart site, and some white workers went to pray with them. All of the black workers and the ministers were arrested. The white workers weren't. And so then the white workers held a press conference to demand to be arrested. Which, of course, did exactly what I suggested. It highlighted the disparity. It highlighted the blind enforcement of categories of persons, right, in a way that without forming that common cause, without noticing race, would have been invisible. Right. So when you talk about climate change, climate justice is, of course, part of it. right? And noticing the impact of climate change on disadvantaged communities, right, is another way in which the Miners Canary can alert us to the impact of climate policy and what that policy ought to be. Years ago, I have to say, I'm quite used to writing things that my colleagues say, really roll their eyes and say, "Oh God," well, I don't want to curse, so I won't exactly tell you what one of my colleagues said about some stuff I wrote. But nonetheless, oh God, about 10 years ago, maybe longer ago, 12 years ago, right, I wrote an essay called "Who Owns the Sky?" And the argument was pretty simple, right? Which is that the atmosphere, right, belongs to everyone who uses it. That would be everyone who breathes, last I checked. And because everyone who breathes has an interest in the quality of the atmosphere, we ought to be somewhat suspicious of regulatory techniques that allow certain members of our society to extract value from the carbon carrying capacity of the atmosphere to the detriment of the rest of us. So I propose a very simple thing, which is that to the extent that you do cap and trade stuff and you collect fees, that some of those fees ought to go into a fund, and we'll call it like a trust fund for all the breathers in America. At least I'm just focused on America, right? So that it wouldn't go to the government, right? It doesn't belong to the state, right? It belongs to the people, right? It belongs to the people in the way that what you expect to get out of Social Security belongs to the people, right? Except that this fund, which comes out of trading for cleaning up the atmosphere, ought to redound to the benefit of those people for whom the atmosphere exists. That would be us, right? Crazy idea. Well, you know, most of you probably are unaware, but some of you aren't, right, of our Children's Trust lawsuit, which was filed recently. I wrote the law professor's amicus brief for that lawsuit, but basically makes the argument that there's a public trust in the atmosphere, and while we can't order government to do any specific thing, we can order through a technique called legislative remand the government to do something. And you know, the amazing thing is we prevailed, at least at the trial court in Texas. Right? And if we could win in the trial court in Texas, right, I'm just saying we might be able to win more places than that. Right? Right? But the idea, right, is that the children, right, who will bear the brunt of our inaction, right, we're the perfect plaintiffs in this case. Not us in the room, right? But those kids and their kids, right, who they can't even literally conceive of yet, right, will be the ones who bear the brunt of our failure to act. In 1974, when I was an undergraduate, before some of you were born, I know, I heard the first talk on climate change, right? That was 1974. Right? People were already it was at Stanford, and it was one of the earth science guys gave a lecture, right? And he was despairing even then, right? The time to act, obviously, is always now, right? How you act, of course, is what we're here to think about. So, how race enters this, how you produce durable legal change. You need to change the culture, right? And that's the way this links with yesterday's talk. I began, if you read the little synopsis that was included in the material, with a quote from Jim Wallace, right? And he said, and this is the title of actually a book that Lonnie and I are currently writing, right, is that you don't get change by changing politicians to the extent that politicians like, stick a wet finger in the air to figure out which way the wind is blowing, right? Exchanging one wet-fingered politician for another is not the task, right? The task is to change the wind, because we know they will go in the direction that the wind moves. We know they will go in the direction the wind moves. So our job is to change the wind. That's a big task. That's a big task. But it only works, right, if you trust people to make decisions, and you trust the culture to be able to withstand the changes that it's going to take, right? And cultural adaptability is critical, but also trusting people is critical. And let me give you one more example. I only have about a minute or two left. Because I'm a gadfly, and there are a lot of problems in Texas, I got involved in middle school education reform based on this hypothesis that Texas wasn't going to spend any more money on education, and that there were poor schools around the state that were producing academic excellence. And so what I did is I looked at all of the school districts in Texas. There's 1,500 school districts. Identified the 26 Title I schools districts that were producing academic excellence defined as high graduation rate, matriculation to 2- and 4-year colleges, or employment past graduation. And then I got in my car and I just drove out to these districts. And I interviewed people. I talked to activists, principals, teachers, students, and I wanted to see what's the secret. What's the secret, right? Because there's got to be something. Well, of course there's no secret. Of course there's no secret. The secret, to the extent that there is one, is that you produce a non-retributive accountability scheme in the schools, and it's run by people who pay attention to details. And you build a community from the school out, not from the community in. And so I'll end with this story. I told it in our small group, but I'll repeat it here. We did this with I took all these stories that I learned around Texas and produced a plan, and I convinced the Austin Unified School District to let me run a program in a school in Austin. It was about to become a magnet school. It was going to be the law and government magnet school. So the first thing we did is we said no. We don't want a magnet school here where it's going to be a school in a school. We're going to work with you to bring a magnet school here only if it brings greater resources to the school as a whole and benefits not just the kids in the magnet program, but the kids in the school as a whole. Second, we built what we call a parents' room, which was just a trailer, just outside the gates of the school, but on the school grounds, where the parents could meet. In there, we built a clothes bank so that kids who needed clothes could go and get clothes without having to ask for it. And critically, we invited the principal to come out to the parents' room every Friday to talk with these parents, because we wanted the parents to talk about educational policy. If we'd said that to them, they never would have talked about educational policy. But over the course of the year, through these conversations with the principal, they in fact were talking about educational policy, right? And they produced changes at that middle school that exist to this day. So that the idea of making a parents' room is now integrated into the design of the new schools that are being built in Austin. Right? Because it gives the parents a space to own that is not under the jurisdiction of the school, but is part of the school. That's a kind of culture change, and it's in a little tiny nutshell, right? A little tiny example. But we need to do that more broadly, bigger, and I hope the discussion we have today continues on that path. Thank you.